Hi, and welcome to another episode of Geography Made Easy. In these videos, we try to make difficult geographical concepts easy. Today, we will be discussing about population with special reference and emphasis on India, as well as looking at different concepts which are related to population. This chapter is very important in the context of the examination and otherwise as well. Before we start the chapter, we will be first comparing India's population with that of the rest of the world. According to 2011 census, the population of India is just second after China, who is the most populous country of the world. This was the statistics when the book which we are reading for the ISC syllabus was written. But very recently, a few days ago, we saw that India has overtaken China and has become the most populous country in the world. So India is right now the the first or the most populous country in the world. It contains around 17.5% of the total population of the world. So this figure has also, I'm sure, increased. So we will just consider this value as an average. Growth rate, which is the rate at which the population increases in any country or in any region, is known as the growth rate. That equals to the entire population of Australia, which means that every year we are adding the population of Australia to our population, which is a huge number. USA is just ranking third after India. So, however, though USA's population is high and it ranks just after India, the gap between India and USA in the total number of population is huge, which is of 901.5 million persons. So between the first, second and the third position, the second and the third position is huge. And India and China follow close on the heels. So China right now is seeing a decline in their population, and India still has a growth rate which is higher, and hence it has overtaken China in its population figures. We look at this figure, which is a pie diagram, where the population of India in comparison to other countries has been given. So we can see China has 19.4% population and India has 17.5 population, going with the previous census data. Right now, India's population will be more, it has increased, but we'll still go with this figure because this is what has been published in the book. So until a revised version of the book comes out, we will keep following these figures. After that, we have USA, and we can see that the sectorial angles, or the angle of the pie between China and India, is more or less similar. USA, which is the third most populous country, has a huge or a much lesser size of the angle in the pie diagram. This is followed by Indonesia, Brazil, then Pakistan, then we have Bangladesh, then followed by Nigeria, Russia, Japan, and finally the other countries of the world, the European countries, the Latin American countries, and other countries like Australia, they constitute 41.2% of the total population of the world. So the share of population has been represented here, and we can see that India and China both have very high populations, and we nearly constitute the entire or a huge chunk of the population of the world. Now this is what we have been talking about. This has been very recently published a few days back, where we have seen that this is the population of China. This is the line figure or the line graph, and this is the population of India. So from 2000 onwards to 2023, we can see that here India has overtaken the population of China. So China's population right now is 1.41 billion, whereas India's population has become 1.42 billion. Now we will be looking at some technical topics or definitions which are very important, and we need to understand them if we want to study population geography. The first and the most important understanding which we have to have before we go into population is the population data collection methodology, which is called the census. Census is data collected about populations for a particular administrative period over a regular interval period. So for a particular administrative area over a regular interval of period, when data is collected, it is called the census. Every country has its census. For India, the census is usually takes place after 10 years. However, the last census data which is available to us is from the 2011 census. Because of the COVID situation in 2020, the 2021 census could not be held. The government is planning to carry out the 2021 census very soon. So we have to right now rely on other sources for the data, but we don't have any final data which has been published by India which would tell us exact figures. So we have to rely right now on the 2011 data. The first census that was conducted in India was in the year 1872. So this was conducted during the colonial period by the British administration. The first census in 1872 was not a complete and synchronous and centralized census carried out for the entire Indian subcontinent, but it was in small samples in certain areas only. The first complete and synchronous centralized census carried out by the British was in 1881. Of course, the objective of carrying out such a census by the then British government was for their administrative needs. They had to understand how much people were living in India in order to govern or administer or rule the country better. In India, census is conducted every 10 years. This is mostly the commonly thing which is seen in most countries. 1921 is known as the census year of big divide, and we will go into details about this, that why in 1921 census could not be held. There has been certain incidents in 1921 which led to a which led to a divide or a change in the census. In this year, we see that after 1921, the population of India has been steadily increasing, and the growth rate has been consistently high. And finally, 2021 is the year when census has been delayed to 2024 due to the COVID-19 pandemic situation. Now we will be discussing about the population distribution of India. So according to the 2011 census, the total population of India was 1210.2 million. Now this population is not evenly distributed throughout the entire country. Rather, some states have more population than the other states. There are several reasons for this kind of uneven distribution of population throughout the country. We will be discussing each of these in details, but just briefly I would like to say that certain states have concentration of resources which leads to an agglomeration of population in those states compared to other states which may be emptier or have less population density because of the geography or terrain of those states. Some of the most some of the states having the highest density of population are Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Bihar, West Bengal, and Andhra Pradesh. On the other hand, Nagaland, Goa, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Mizoram have low populations. Now, if we compare these five states with the five states which have less population, we can understand that geography plays a very important role here in determining which state will have more population and which states will have less dense population. Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim and Mizoram are states in the where the Himalayas or the other hills are present. So the uneven terrain does not allow too much dense population growth in these areas. In comparison to Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Bihar, West Bengal and Andhra Pradesh, they have flat terrain, and here we see that the population density and the growth has been higher. The Union Territory of Lakshadweep, which is an island, has the lowest population. And as we have discussed is that density of population differs from one state to the other. Now let us discuss about the density of population. What is the population density? It is the number of people living in one unit area. So, population density can be discussed or described with the help of a formula, which is the total population is divided by the total area, and it is measured in persons per square kilometer. So if we take a state or a given particular area, we have to know about the total number of people living in that area. So if this is a particular area, if this is areas is around 5 square kilometer and we have 100 people living in this, so population density in this case will be 100 people divided by 5 square kilometer area. So the population density is 20 persons per square kilometer. So for every square kilometer, 20 people are living in this area. So this is the measurement for the density of persons. It might be possible that in this 5 square kilometer, this part has more than 20 persons living and this part has less number of persons living. But here we are considering the entire area and we are averaging it out the 100 people between the total 5 square kilometer area that is present in this case. India's average population density is 382 persons per square kilometer. But this is the average density for the entire country. But we know that density can be much more for certain states and much less for other states. So states with highest density of population are Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, Kerala and the NCR region of Delhi. So we can cite the total number of populations here. I mean the density of population here. Say for example, if we take the NCR area of Delhi, it is 11,297. So we have the average for India is 382 and compare that to Delhi NCR which is 11,297. A huge number of persons are living in the small area which is the Delhi NCR area. Similarly, we have states which have very low density of population. These states are Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh and Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Let's again take another example. For Sikkim, it is 86 persons per square kilometer. So, the national average is 382, whereas for Sikkim, it is only 86. Or if we take the example of Nagaland, it is 119 persons, whereas the average density for India is 382. So we have this uneven distribution of population for the entire country of India. In certain states, we see that the density of population is much greater than the national average, and in certain states, it is much less. We have the map of India here, which is showing the density of population for the year 2011. So we have categorized or classified the density. The dark green is where the density is less than 100. Between 101 persons to 250 persons is the light green, followed by 251 to 500, which is the yellow. Then the dark yellow or orange is 500 to 1000, and more than 1001 persons per square kilometer is denoted by the dark orange. So as we can see, Bihar, West Bengal, NCR region, these have populations which is greater than 1001. 501 to 1000 we have Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Punjab. Here the area of Uttar Pradesh is much more, so the density becomes less. When we look at the states having less density, we have Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, Sikkim. So in this way, the density of population which we were discussing with the help of data can be shown on the map. And if we compare the different densities of population between the different census years, we can make a comparison as to how much the density of population has changed over the years. Now this density of population can be calculated with the help of certain formulas. The density of population is calculated through something which is also called the index of concentration, which is the mathematical value or the statistical formula which can be used to discuss or to calculate density. We have four types of density calculation formulas. The first one is arithmetic density, then we have the physiological density, the third one is agricultural density, and the fourth is index of concentration. Each density of population formula is used for different reasons. Let us see the first one. The first one is arithmetic density, which is found or which is calculated by dividing the total population by total area. This is what we have shown in the previous slides, where we were discussing about the different kinds of population density between the different states of India. Then we have the physiological density. The physiological density takes into account total population and net cultivated area. This physiological density talks about population in terms of the amount of area which is present for cultivation. Hence, this physiological density calculation will help in explaining the food shortage or food conditions of the country. If the net cultivated area reduces in comparison to total population, then drought conditions, famine conditions, as well as food shortage conditions may occur for the country. Next, we have agricultural density, where total agricultural population is divided by net cultivable area. So here we are taking into account only those persons who are engaged directly in agricultural pursuits. In most cases, the population living in the rural areas. That is divided by the net cultivable area, so which will give us the agricultural density, that is the density of population engaged in agriculture divided by total area which is under cultivation. This is a more viable way of looking at density of population, because this is talking about livelihood. So if my net cultivable area is reducing, my total agricultural population should also reduce. That means that the population is now shifting and getting engaged in some other pursuits or other activities for their economic well-being. If that is not happening, and if the net cultivable area is reducing without the total agricultural population reducing, that can lead to serious concerns for the economy of the country, because that means that there is underemployment or unemployment or even disguised unemployment in the agricultural sector. Finally, we have the index of concentration, a more comprehensible way of understanding population density, which is, the formula is proportion of persons living in each state, so divided by the state or union territory divided by the total population of India. This gives us a understanding as to the number of people living in the state to the total population of India. So what role the density has to the increasing density of the country can be explained with the help of this index. Now we will be discussing about the different factors which affect the distribution and density of population. The first factor which we are going to talk about, and which we have already discussed previously, is the terrain or the topography. The terrain plays a very important role in situating or distributing the population in a given area. Places which have less rugged terrain or topography, that is plain areas or plateau tops, will have more population density than hilly areas which have a rugged topography. This is because it is easier to build houses and settle down in a terrain which is flatter compared to a territory which is undulating. Also, we see that this has a direct impact on the agricultural productivity. Hence, large towns are made or get created near or in flat regions. The next very important factor here which we need to consider is climate. Climate plays a very important role in locating the distribution and density of population. Very harsh and extreme climates do not allow a lot of population density to take place, or a lot of population growth to take place in a particular area. Regions which have favorable climate, we see that the population is much more. That is why in the coastal areas in all the continents, we see that most of the population of the world is concentrated. In very rugged and hilly terrain with unfavorable climate, or very extremes of climate with very hot climate or very cold climate, we do not see a large number of people living in those areas. For example, people will not like to live in on the Arctic or Greenland or even Antarctica compared to the Ganges Plains or the Nile Valley. So climate here is favorable, and the terrain plays an important role as to in which place the people would like to live. Following in the footsteps of terrain and climate is soil. The type of soil determines the agriculture, and hence we see that this has a direct bearing on the population density. Where the soils are fertile, population densities are high. People tend to agglomerate in those areas compared to places which have soil which is poor in quality or infertile. Similarly, water bodies are also places around which population has tended to become or has thrived around water bodies. In the ancient times, when settlement was just beginning to form, water formed a very important role in the formation or in the place to determine where a civilization would thrive. That is why all the major civilizations which would have higher densities compared to any other place were around water bodies. In the desert areas also, we see that the settlements tends to form around a water body. So historically speaking, this was a very important factor which would determine where population density would be. Of course, now this has changed, but water still plays a very important role. The next three factors which we will be talking about, which is mineral resources, industries and transport network, is more or less associated not with agrarian societies but more with industrial societies, where we see that where there is rich minerals, sometimes people tend to agglomerate in those areas or form settlements in those areas and live in those areas. For example, in West Bengal, Jharkhand, we see the colliery belt where towns like Bokaro have grown. This is because of the mining and mining activity which human beings have done. So the presence of the minerals has led to the formation of population density. Similarly, we also see industries agglomerating in certain areas. They can be, of course, agricultural industries, or they can be mineral-based industries, which again we have seen like places like Durgapur, Asansol, Burnpur, Kulti in the colliery belt. These have developed around the industries which have developed along the DVC corporation as well as along the mines and the steel factories. Transport network forms a very important role as to determine whether in a particular area there will be high density of population or not. If transportation is poor, people would not like to live in a particular area. In very remote areas where there is transport is not well connected, we see that people don't tend to live in those areas. So here again we see like in certain parts of the Himalayas, in certain towns where which is very remote, we sometimes see that the transport network is not possible to develop it too well because of extreme climatic conditions or terrain conditions, and hence we again see that that is another reason why the density of population is low in these areas. Finally, we have the eighth point, which is urbanization. Urbanization and population concentration go hand in hand, and we know that urban centers in compared to rural areas have much more higher density of population. So a place would tend to become more and more urbanized if the other favorable factors are present, and in urbanized areas we see that the density of population is much greater. So in India, in any city in the urban areas, we know that the population density is very high. Now we are going to talk about some basic concepts of population growth. And here we are going to talk about some statistical methods by which population growth of a country is determined. The first two concepts are the birth rate and the death rate. Birth rate is, the formula for this is number of live births. It is written in this way, divided by total mid-year population. I'll just write 2 TP into 1000. Here we have to see that the population is taken as an average, so the mid-year population is considered in this case, not at the end of the year. So total number of live births, that is the number of children who are not stillborn, they are considered by the total population into 1000, which gives us the birth rate of the population. Similarly, number of deaths, so number of people dying divided by total mid-year population into 1000 gives us the death rate. So in a particular area, in a particular place, when the birth rate is greater than the death rate, we have a positive growth. So in India and most of the developing nations, they have a positive growth rate. But in certain countries, some are experiencing negative growth rate, where the death rate is exceeding the birth rate. This can happen when either the birth rate starts falling down or the death rate has increased. So if we take into consideration the cases where death rate increases, we can have any kind of natural calamity where we see that the death rate for that country has all of a sudden increased. So it could be any reason, like any kind of disease, or it can be war, or it can be famine or drought, and we see that death rate in that country has increased. Or on the other hand, we see that death rate has not got impacted, but the birth rate has fallen. And this is the case for most of the developed nations in the present day, where we see that the birth rate has started falling and the death rate is more now. So places like China, like Japan, even China in certain areas is experiencing this. And countries, the most of the European countries are actually experiencing a slowing down or a birth rate which is lesser than the death rate. So what happens is, this is known as the growth rate. The growth rate of the population starts falling down. Now this has a problem. In a country like India, growth rate is high, which is a good indication of a healthy population, where we know that newer people are being added into the population, which means that this new generation which is born after a certain number of years, they are going to join the workforce. So we will always have a young population, which is the working population. On the other hand, if we have the number of old people who have increased and the growth rate is reducing, that means no new population is getting added to the country, then what happens is that the people after a certain age, the senior citizens, they are unable to work, their work efficiency falls, and what we see is that the productivity of those countries can fall, and liabilities in the form of old age homes, in the form of pensions, in the form of other facilities given to the dependent population increases. But also, if the birth rate is too high than the death rate, and this is the case even in case of all the developing nations, when the birth rate is too high than the death rate, that also becomes a big problem or a big challenge, because it leads to other economic problems which becomes difficult to address, like unemployment, underemployment, disguised unemployment, and so on. So the metrics to understand this kind of anomaly, whether the country or the state is going through a healthy growth in population, is done through with the help of the growth rate, where the change in population between two time periods are done, and growth rate is measured in case of India for every census data. So every 10 years we calculate the growth rate, we calculate the growth rate and we try to understand whether growth rate is increasing or growth rate has started decreasing. So there is a natural growth rate. Nature, in order for the human race to survive, we will have a natural birth rate which will be higher than the natural death rate in most cases. So that is called the natural growth rate. Even in the primitive societies where medicine or the life expectancy of people was less, that is the number of years for which a person lived was less, we see that the birth rate was very high. Human beings have very high birth rate. But with time, with medicines, with increase in life expectancy, and with the introduction of contraception, we have seen that we can regulate our birth rate, because it is important to regulate birth rate. Now let us look at the other types of growth which is there. So we have the natural growth which we have discussed. We have the migratory growth. Migratory growth is the change in the population due to migration of people into one place or from one place into another place. So for example, if there is conflict in one area and people are moving away from that conflict ridden country into another country, there is a negative growth rate in that area. We can take some examples, very recent contemporary examples such as Afghanistan, where we have seen there was a mass exodus, people went away or were trying to escape from Afghanistan. Similarly, we see that similar situation in Ukraine where people were migrating out of Ukraine. So that kind of a population change where there is a negative growth, it impacts the population of the place from which this migration is taking place and to the place where migration is taking place. One of the major changes because of a migratory growth was during the partition of India, where we see that a lot of people moved across the borders of the hastily drawn borders of East and West Pakistan, leading to a drastic change in the number of people living on either side of the borders. And finally, we have the positive growth rate. That is an increase in population between two time periods. So if the population is increasing, it is called the positive growth rate. And we have the negative growth rate, where if the population is decreasing between two time periods, we have a negative growth rate. India has a positive growth rate, but of course, thankfully, the growth rate has started reducing with introduction of two-child policies and other policies. Education, it has started falling, but our base population is so high that it is still a dream to achieve that completely. Now we are going to see how we can calculate growth rate of population. Now this question has come in ISC 2017. So growth rate, the formula is P2 minus P1 by P2 into 100. We have to understand what P2 and P1 is. So P1 is population of base year. And P2 is the present population. Let's take an example. So two populations will be given in this case also. For 4 states, the population for 2001 and 2011 were given. So say we have 1991 and 2001, and we have the population for let's take an example, say New Delhi. I'll take a simple example. Say population was 10,000 in 1991, it became 20,000 in 2001. The base year is the year which is the older, or from which we are projecting and trying to find out the growth rate, because as we have discussed, growth rate is the change in the population which is calculated between two time periods. So the older time period, this will become my base year in this case. If this was 2000 and 2011, then 2001 would become my base year. So in this way my base year will change. So this is a very simple formula. So if I have to find out growth rate, so this is my P1 and this is my P2. So population for P2 will be 20,000 minus P1 base year is 10,000 divided by population is 20,000, right? So this will come as 10,000 divided by 20,000, 0.5%. So my growth rate of population for New Delhi between 1991 and 2001 is 0.5%. So if I am given 4 states or 4 regions and I am given this data will be given to me, and if I am given this data along with the 3 or 4 states and the 2 years, then I can easily calculate the growth rate of each state and find out which has the highest or the lowest. So in this question, it was they had asked us to identify the state with the highest growth rate of population. So this can only be done when you are calculating for each state and the one with the highest growth rate. So highest, this number will be your answer. And another question has been asked along with the growth rate is the absolute growth. Absolute growth is the total number of persons which get added to the population, and this can be very simply done. So absolute growth in case of New Delhi will be the present year P2 minus the base year, so 20,000 minus 10,000. So 10,000 is my absolute growth. This will not come as a percentage because I am not converting it into a percentage. I do not calculating rate, growth rate or a percentage. I am calculating the absolute values in this case. So if this kind of question comes, this is a very scoring question and the students should be able to very easily do these small calculations in the examination. Now let us examine the growth rate which has taken place in India, how it has changed over the years. So we have 4 phases of population growth rate. The first phase is the slow growth rate phase or 1901 to 1921, which is also called a phase where the growth rate was slow or stagnant. So 1901, 1921, this is the time period in colonial India when we see that the death rate is very high than the birth, and the birth rate was also high, but the death rate being very high, also there was World War I and a lot of Indians fought in World War I and they died. There was a pandemic, the Spanish flu, which happened and that also affected the death rates. Apart from that, there were famines in India which led to a very high death rate, and hence we see a slow growth in this period. Next we have the 1921. So I just forgot to say that 1921 is considered as the watershed year or the demographic divide, where after 1921 India does not see a growth rate which is slow or a growth rate which is negative, rather it starts seeing a positive steady growth rate. 1921 to 1951 is the second phase where we see a steady growth rate. where again death rate is high but birth rate is also high. India gains independence, and prior to that, from 1951 to 1981, we see a rapid growth rate because of the fall in death rate. Here we see that the government of India has started introducing advanced medicine and to cure diseases such as polio and many of the other very infectious diseases like cholera, typhoid. These were they were cured, tuberculosis. So this led to an overall increase in the health of the population, a reduction in the mortality rates, and also a reduction in the child mortality rates. So death rates started falling, and steadily we see an increase in the life expectancy of people living in India. So this is the phase where we see a rampant increase in the population of India. The base population of India increased during this phase with very large number of families. But we also start seeing that now people start becoming aware. So post 1981, we again see a growth rate decline where the number of births started declining because there were a lot of campaigning through television. Of course, before this we had radio, but 1981 we see slowly television penetrating the Indian households. 1990s onwards, electrification of villages, remote areas, and the penetration of the televisions in the common man's house led to a kind of a revolution which got translated into different ways or awareness programs being given to people about high birth rate. And contraception also was introduced in this phase, with more and more contraceptions and health centers being formed in villages where they started promoting the use of contraception. We have seen that that led to a decline in the growth rate. We see the two child family policy coming into play in the late 1980s, 1990s, where we see hum do hamare do becoming a very common tagline for Indian small families. Joint families slowly breaking up and becoming more and more nuclear, and hence we again see that that leads to a decline in the growth rate. More and more women joining the workforce also leads to a lowering in the birth rates, or the want or the expectancy of having children starts falling. And thus from post 1981 we have seen a decline in the growth rate of the Indian population. Every census year it is seen that the growth rate is slowly declining, but because our base population is very high, the net result is still not visible, and still we have the problems of population in India. Let us look at this graph. So this graph starts from the year 1901 to 2011, more than 100 years. And with this is the on the y-axis we have the population in millions, and this is how the growth has increased, and it is still increasing. But we can see that 1981 onwards, the growth has increased, but the rate or the growth rate has decreased. We see a change in from 1991 to 2000, a huge jump. But again from 2001 to 2011, that has reduced. The jump has reduced. These years it was more or less stagnant, as we have seen stagnant years in 1901 to 1921, 31 to 15 normal, and we see a huge steep rise post independence in the growth rate of population in India. However, with more government interventions, with more population policies being brought about, with educating people, this problem of population can be reduced. And we need to focus more and more on creating individuals who are resources and population which is not liabilities. This can only be achieved through education. Let us look at the decadal growth rate, the percentage of decadal growth rate. So we have from 1951 onwards, and we have seen that apart from the year 1950-61 to 1971, when there was a increase in the decadal growth rate. So every 10 years the growth rate is calculated, and it was more or less stagnant from 1971 to 1981. From 1981 onwards, we are seeing a decline. And as we can see, from 2001 to 2011, there has been a steep decline in the growth rate. And this is further declining. When we get the 2024 census, we are going to see statistics which reflect on further decrease in growth rate. So growth rate of population in India is falling, but as I have already said, because the base of population is high, it is still a problem, and still we see very high growth of population. But the rate of the growth has definitely decreased, which is a very positive sign in case of India. Now let us discuss a little bit about the regional variations of population growth rate according to which region. So we have seen that there is a fall in the growth rate in most of the states and the union territories. So overall the Indian population is experiencing a fall in the growth rate. Only one state, which is Nagaland, has seen a negative growth rate. Nagaland is one state with very high literacy rates. Mizoram, Nagaland, these are the northeastern states have high literacy rates, and this is one reason. And apart from that also there is out migration, and also in some cases there might be unrest in these areas which lead to negative growth rates. In case of Nagaland, I think most of the population has out migrated from Nagaland. There has been certain reasons why this state is the only state which has experienced a negative growth. However, positive growth rate, and some of the states which are experiencing some of the highest positive growth rates are Bihar, Jammu and Kashmir, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Meghalaya and Arunachal Pradesh. We have Meghalaya and Arunachal Pradesh, two northeastern states, experiencing positive growth rate or increase in growth rate. Meghalaya, because of the rich mineral resources, more and more industries are being set up in Meghalaya, which is leading to an increase in the growth rate. So this is mostly because of migration. And Arunachal Pradesh is because right now Arunachal Pradesh is peaceful. The cities have started growing, prospering. Northeastern states are prospering more than they were. So it has seen a positive growth rate or a natural growth increase in the growth rate in these areas. Bihar already has a very high population growth rate, and Bihar and Jharkhand still experience high growth rates of population in this last decade. Let us look at the map where we can understand about the decadal growth rate between 2001 to 2011. So, states which have less than 10% growth rate are Nagaland and Kerala. So, these two states, Nagaland is having very high literacy, similarly Kerala, and we can directly here correlate literacy with growth rate. So people tend to have less children. When people become aware about the liabilities of having very large families, that has led to an decrease in the growth rates in Nagaland and Kerala. Most of the states, the other states, are experiencing 10 to 20%. We can see that most of the southern Indian states and Gujarat and West Bengal and some of the northeastern states and these hill states are all experiencing 10 to 20%. So the national average has decreased of growth rate. 20 to 30% is the high density areas. We have the northern plains. So we have the Rajasthan plain, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, and we have Madhya Pradesh. We have the flat terrain or the states which have more or less terrain which is flat, which is still seeing a positive growth rate, which is just not because of the presence of a flat terrain here in this case, but also because historically they have had high populations. Culturally, their large families have been preferred. So here still, and the education percentage is still low in some of these states. So more and more people need to be made aware and educated, and then only the growth rates will decrease. We have no state with higher than 30% growth rate, which is the good thing about India's situation. So, if we have to translate as to what is the implications of high population growth rate, so directly it has an implication on development and how much the country will economically, socially, culturally develop into a better nation. We know that the world is divided into the developed and the developing nations. The developed nations all have populations which are much less than the developing nations, because higher populations means more liabilities. The resources get divided, and not every individual can be looked after by the state properly. So benefits such as health benefits, education benefits cannot be properly implemented if the population is so high, if it is too high. So the development index of countries with very high populations, they start falling, and this is one of the most serious implications of population, and that is the reason why people are so concerned about a high population, because it directly has an impact on the development. If too many people are using the finite resources, because our resources are finite, then that becomes a problem. Next is the environmental degradation, which has direct implications with population. Because more the number of people, more place they require to stay, more mouths you need to feed, more bodies need to be clothed. If I have to even talk about the basics, the environment will get degraded, because forest has to be cut and cleared to make space for agricultural land, for making cities, for homes. So that leads to an environmental degradation, and this has a direct bearing on the ecological imbalance. That is the environment, the ecology, which is in a state of a balance between the humans, the non-humans, and the plants, the animals, and all the other creatures which are living on the earth, that gets disrupted if there are too many human beings in that area. We have seen because of environmental degradation, we have seen because of too much of this degradation is taking place when we are trying to make the maximum use of a particular resource or a natural resource which is available to us. So many a times these problems, because of high population, they arise from this these because of high population the problem arises, and that cannot be completely mitigated. So these are the three areas where we need to think about how to reduce populations. So finally we have come to the important questions for the exam. This chapter is very important from examination point of view. Every year one or two questions have been asked from the population chapter. So some of the most common questions have been data and statistics related to highest and lowest numbers. They have asked the name of the states and reasons. So whenever you are studying about the highest and the lowest states, please look at the reasons as to why in particular area there is more population density, why in a particular there is less density, what is the implication of literacy versus population, because it is all related. And one has to study the formulas and the definitions, because they can come as short answers, they can be given as calculations, and these are very scoring. So I think if you are clear with them, you will do well in this particular chapter. So if you have any doubts and questions, please feel free to leave a comment in the chat section. And if you are finding my videos helpful, please feel free to share it with your friends. And I'll see you in the next video. So till then, happy learning.